Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 102nd deck and it's titled Highway to the Danger Zone. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So a couple of things before we really get into it. First, I do want to apologize if my voice sounds a little bit weird, maybe slurring my speech a little bit. I recently had a tooth implant put in, so my mouth is not 100%, but hopefully it doesn't come across too bad throughout the course of the video. If it does, I apologize, but at least I'm still getting the video out. The other thing we got to talk about before we actually get going is, of course, to go through some ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you are interested in doing. So some great ways to reach out to us if you're interested in talking to me, asking questions, suggesting cards. You can find us over on Twitter at 13POYNZ, Reddit u/POYNZ13, and email at dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. Those are all great ways to do all of that stuff. But if you're looking to actually support the channel a little bit, you can head on over to TCG Player using our affiliate link that is in the description of the video. Once you're there, any cards you purchase, we get a little bit of a kickback from as a thank you for sending you their way. And then finally, the most direct way that you can help support us is Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide. And right now, you'll get access to a ton of great things like a Discord channel where you actually get to brew up some of the decks and you get to participate in some games if that's something you're interested in doing. You'll also be able to get a random card sent to you every single month as a thank you for all of your support. You'll get access to the unedited gameplay videos as well as the deck lists an entire week early. So obviously some great stuff out there, and I do have to shout out our 5 current patrons. We've got William Swiftfoot, we've got Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Way, and Jeff Winger. So to the 5 of you, thank you all so much for all of your support. And without any more rambling from me, let's get into the deck tech. So first up, we got to take a look at our random card of the week, which was suggested to us by my friend Shawn. You may have seen him quite a few times on this channel. He's got a lot of great decks. He's a great guy. So of course, he's got a great suggestion for us this week, and that is going to be Phage the Untouchable. So Phage the Untouchable is 3 black, 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 black for a legendary creature, 4/4 avatar minion. When Phage the Untouchable enters the battlefield, if you didn't cast it from your hand, you lose the game. Whenever Phage deals combat damage to a creature, destroy that creature, it can't be regenerated. And whenever Phage deals combat damage to a player, that player loses the game. So an unspoken rule on the channel is if we get a legendary creature as our random card, that means we of course have to make them the commander. Now, you may notice though, there's a couple of unique things about Phage as a commander. One, she's going to be starting in the command zone, which is not in our hand, which means that every time we cast Phage from the command zone, we are not casting her from our hand, meaning we just automatically lose the game. But we are going to try to get around that because obviously we want to be able to play our commander. She's pretty great. If she hits someone, they just lose the game. They destroy any creatures that take damage. So essentially, that leads us into our first theme of this deck, which is making sure that we don't lose the game for just playing our commander. And some great ways to do that are through the use of cards like Campfire, which is 1 mana for an artifact. You can pay 1, tap it, and gain 2 life. Not super relevant, but maybe useful in some cases. And pay 2, tap it, exile Campfire, put all commanders you own from the command zone and from your graveyard into your hand, then shuffle your graveyard into your library. So this is a great way to save our graveyard if someone's going to try to exile it, to make sure that we can protect any creatures we have in there, any spells that we might want. But more importantly, it takes Phage from the command zone, puts her into our hand. Now when we cast her, we're casting her from our hand, so that way we are able to get around the fact that she's going to, well, make us lose the game immediately just for playing her. So Campfire is one of the ways for us to get around this. It's obviously not the only way, but there are some more unique ways to at least prevent ourselves from losing immediately. Now, I won't lie, some of these are a little bit fragile, so it is important to be prepared. There's a good chance that things might be destroyed before Phage hits the board. This is called Highway to the Danger Zone for a reason. There's always a chance that something happens with Phage. Maybe someone blinks her or flickers her. Someone might reanimate her for you. So there's just a ton of different ways that this can go wrong, but that's part of the appeal, right? So that leads us then to our second theme, which is going to be reanimation. We have a ton of ways to bring creatures out of our graveyard and put them into play, and the main reason we're doing this is because we kind of want to draw some of the attention away from Phage. Phage automatically makes people lose the game when she hits them, so people are going to have their eyes on her very, very early. So as long as we are making sure that we're filling up the board with other big threats, it might be difficult for our opponents to know what exactly they should focus on. And if we're just bringing back a ton of big things, we can make sure that even if Phage can't get through, someone deals with Phage, we do still have other big threats on board that can kind of close out the game instead. So Phage is the main game plan, but of course we got to have a backup because we can't go all in on one specific creature, especially one that's so hard to cast, and not even just hard to cast in the sense that we lose the game, but hard to cast in the sense that she's 7 mana, 4 of which does have to be black, and yeah, we're mono black, so it's not that big of a deal, but it is still something to be concerned about. And so a great example of all of that is Entreat the Dead, which is XX black, black, black. It does have Miracle for X black, black. We're probably not going to Miracle it, but you never know. It's a sorcery that says return X target creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. So if we cast it for its normal casting cost, it would be 5 mana just to get back 1 creature, which is not terrible, but it's not really good. Whereas if we spend 5 mana for its miracle cost, we actually get 3 creatures back out of our graveyard. So that is a great way to bring back a ton of creatures, and it's a nice little callback to some other things that we could do with the deck, such as putting our creatures into our graveyard and then hopefully drawing some extra cards. And then finally, that brings us to our last major theme. We talked about the creatures that we want to be reanimating, but I want to be a little bit more specific about that, because we're not just reanimating giant creatures with no abilities. We are trying to reanimate creatures that either give us some value or deal with the board in some way. So a great example of that is Death Tyrant, which is 4 and a black for a 4/6 Beholder skeleton. It's got Menace, so it's got quite the body and quite the stats just on its own, but it also has a negative energy cone that says whenever an attacking creature you control or a blocking creature an opponent controls dies, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. That allows us to just get creatures in play just for combat happening naturally. It is important that it doesn't have to be creatures that are blocking our creatures. If our opponents attack each other and they have blocking creatures that die, we still get the zombies. That is incredibly relevant because that's going to be happening quite a bit, at least hopefully quite a bit, throughout the course of the game. And then, of course, it does also have a final ability. We can pay 6 mana and return it from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So if we have nothing better to do or we have a little extra mana, it's a great way to kind of keep the train rolling just in case we need it. And it's a great protection against board wipes as well. So those are all of our themes. And the next thing that we're going to have to do is take a look at some key cards. These are the cards that are the win conditions. They're the big splashy value pieces. These are the cards we really want to see because they're really going to help us win the game. The first of which is going to be Incarnation Technique. Now, Incarnation Technique has very quickly become a favorite card of mine because every time I see it played, it just puts in so much work. So it is 4 and a black for a sorcery that says Demonstrate. So when we cast this spell, we can copy it, but if we do, we choose an opponent to also copy it. Then we mill 5 cards, return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So on its base form, if we don't demonstrate, this is 5 mana, mill 5, return a creature from our graveyard to the battlefield. Like we talked about with Entreat the Dead, that's not super great. However, if we demonstrate it, we are now milling 10 cards and returning 2 creatures from our graveyard to the battlefield, all for 5 mana. That is incredibly powerful because even if we don't hit something good in the 10 cards we mill, we don't have to return a creature from those 10 cards. We can return a creature from our graveyard just in general. The milling is just a chance to get us something else. So Incarnation Technique is great in that sense. And yeah, we have to give an opponent a copy of it, but there's a good chance there's at least one player at the table who either doesn't have a graveyard, or maybe they're not really playing a creature style deck, or the creatures that they are playing aren't going to be super relevant. They might just be, Llanowar Elves, little mana dorks, things like that. So we can pick and choose who we give the copy to, but there's a very good chance that whatever we get is going to be significantly more impactful than whatever our opponents get. And that is why I think Incarnation Technique is not just a key card of this deck, but very quickly becoming one of my personal favorite cards. That then leads us into key card number 2, which is going to be Endless Whispers. Normally, Endless Whispers isn't going to be doing too much other than creating a bit of a chaotic board state, but in this deck, it's actually a bit of a win condition. So Endless Whispers is 2 black for an enchantment that says each creature has, when this creature is put into a graveyard from play, choose target opponent. That player puts this creature card from that graveyard into play under their control at the end of turn. Now, this is a great way to make sure that if any of our opponent's creatures die, we can actually just kind of shift the cards around, so that way we can try to force our opponents to attack each other, block their cards, whatever it may be. But it's also impacting our things. And the main reason that this is going to be important is because of Phage. If Phage dies under our control, she goes to the graveyard, and then we get to put her from the graveyard onto an opponent's board, meaning that she has now entered their board, not being cast from their hand, automatically losing them the game. Now, that obviously is going to be a little bit tricky because we'd have to convince someone to kill the Phage and then put the Phage back into play. And then it's going to have to knock out the player. I'm not 100% sure on the rulings here, so if you know, please let me know in the comments. But I believe that because Phage is now controlled by an opponent and that opponent dies, I believe she technically gets exiled, meaning we would have to put her back into the command zone. But that's okay, we just knocked someone out. And like I said, I don't 100% know if that's correct because this is a rule that I always trip up on. So if I'm wrong, please do let me know. Honestly, if I'm right, please let me know because I would like to know the rulings on that one. But that is why I think Endless Whispers is a great key card, because it's just a one-shot kill on any opponent at the table. And finally, we got to get into our last key card, which is going to be Stinging Study. Now, this is not a card that I play very often, so I was a little bit surprised that it's about $6. It's a very expensive card, but with Phage, it makes a lot of sense. So Stinging Study is 4 and a black for an instant. You draw X cards and lose X life, where X is the mana value of a commander you own on the battlefield or in the command zone. Phage is 7 mana. That means that Stinging Study is literally 5 mana, instant speed, draw 7 cards, and lose 7 life. The losing 7 life, not great, but this is an entire new hand of cards that we can get at the end of our opponent's turn, meaning that we just shot really far ahead of everyone else at the table because nobody's going to be able to see this coming, nobody's going to be able to prepare for it. It's going to be a great way to refill our hand, make sure that we always have mana, make sure that we always have removal or protection or creatures or whatever we need at any given time. Stinging Study is going to make sure we get that. So that is why I think all of these cards are great key cards, and Stinging Study, despite being a $6 card, is very much worth the inclusion in the deck. But that is it for our key card section. The next thing we're going to have to do is take a look at some cool interactions. These are some cards that synergize very well together, or might just have an interaction that I want to highlight because, well, I think it's kind of cool. So the first interaction we're going to talk about is going to be between Sir Conrad the Grim and Angel of Suffering. So Sir Conrad is 3 black for a legendary creature, Human Knight, 5/4. Whenever another creature dies or a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, Sir Conrad the Grim deals 1 damage to each opponent, and you can pay 1 and a black. Each player mills a card. Since we were already planning on putting a bunch of stuff into our graveyard and then taking it out of our graveyard, Sir Conrad is already an all-star in this deck and really should be an MVP. The only reason it's not in the key cards section is because I wanted to talk about it here. And the reason I wanted to talk about it here is because it pairs so well with Angel of Suffering, which is 3 black for a 5/3 Nightmare Angel. It's got flying, and if damage would be dealt to you, prevent that damage and mill twice that many cards. So if someone does 1 damage to us, we instead take no damage but mill 2 cards. Same thing goes all the way up to the top though. Someone hits us for 100 damage, we don't take 100 damage, but we do mill 200 cards, which obviously we can't do because our deck's only 100 cards, but that's something to be aware of. But the reason these two work so well together is because Sir Conrad the Grim doesn't care where the creatures are coming from when they hit the graveyard. So if someone hits us for 100 damage and we mill our entire deck, every single creature that goes into the graveyard is doing 1 damage to our opponents. We run quite a few creatures in this deck. So at the bare minimum, we're probably going to be able to do 10 to 15 damage with Sir Conrad throughout the course of the game. And every time we reanimate a creature, which was probably put there by Angel of Suffering, we are doing more damage with Sir Conrad because they're now leaving the graveyard. So all of that is going to be incredibly relevant. And if these two cards stick on the field for any extended period of time, there's definitely no way our opponents are going to be able to come back from this. All right, so that leads us finally to our last cool interaction. And the next one we're going to talk about is going to be between Lich's Mastery and the Mask of Griselbrand. So Lich's Mastery is in here for a couple of reasons. The main one is that it's 3 black, black, black for a legendary enchantment with hexproof that says you can't lose the game. If we cast Phage, it says we lose the game, but with Lich's Mastery, we straight up can't lose the game, so we don't even have to worry about it. However, it also says whenever you gain life, draw that many cards. Whenever you lose life, for each 1 life you lost, exile a permanent you control or a card from your hand or graveyard. And when Lich's Mastery leaves the battlefield, you lose the game. So a lot of downside to a card that's hopefully helping us to cast our commander. But the reason this is here and paired up with Mask of Griselbrand is because Mask of Griselbrand is 1 black, black for a legendary artifact equipment. Equipped creature has flying and lifelink. Whenever equipped creature dies, you may pay X life where X is its power. If you do, draw X cards, equip 3. So Mask of Griselbrand is giving something like, we'll say Phage, because she has 4 power, lifelink. And then since we gain 4 life with Phage having lifelink, we draw 4 cards with Lich's Mastery. This is a great way to make sure that we always have cards in our hand to exile if we need to for Lich's Mastery to trigger. But I also want to highlight the fact that this also works with Angel of Suffering because it says whenever you lose life, then you would exile a permanent. Angel of Suffering means we're no longer taking damage, so unless someone has a direct life loss spell, Lich's Mastery plus Angel of Suffering technically means that we are pretty much never going to lose the game because we can't lose with Lich's Mastery in play, so we can't draw ourselves out. And we're not taking damage, so it's very unlikely that we're going to actually deal with having to, well, lose the game. So something else to consider, I thought about putting those two as the cool interaction, but I really wanted to highlight Mask of Griselbrand and Sir Conrad as well, and I felt this was the best way to do it. But that is the last of our cool interactions, and the last thing we're going to have to talk about, of course, is the price of the deck, since this is a budget show after all. Now, we came very, very close to our budget this week, $99.52, and the vast majority of that actually comes from Torpor Orb, which is just a 2-mana artifact that says creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger, which means that Phage entering the battlefield won't cause us to lose the game, because that is $10.16. So that is a good chunk of our budget. Honestly, cutting it out just cuts us right down to $90, which is already an improvement. I mean, it's literally 10% of our entire budget. So if you do need to cut a card, we do have replacements for this. However, this is the cleanest and most efficient way to prevent us from losing the game to Phage. However, if we have this in play, cast Phage, and someone removes it in response, we will still die to our own Phage trigger. Again, highway to the danger zone. That's just kind of what happens when you play the deck. So something to be aware of. Now, obviously, this is the deck as it stands right now, but there are some out-of-budget upgrades that I would recommend as well. So if you're looking to put this deck together and you want to improve it a little bit, I have a suggestion for you. The main suggestion that I'd like to talk about is going to be Dauthi Embrace. One of the downsides to Phage is that she's just a 4/4. She has no evasion. It's incredibly difficult to give evasion in mono black. We have ways of giving flying, we have ways of giving her lifelink, but we don't really have ways of making her unblockable. So Dauthi Embrace is going to help us do that, because Dauthi Embrace is 2 and a black for an enchantment, where you can pay black, black, and target creature gains shadow until the end of turn, and a creature with shadow can only block other creatures with shadow. So if we give Phage shadow, as long as our opponents don't have anything with shadow, which they're most likely not going to, it's a very uncommon keyword, then we just get through, we hit someone, we knock them out of the game. And the card that I'm going to recommend replacing for this is actually Artisan of Kozilek, which is 9 mana for a 10/9 Eldrazi that says when you cast this spell, you may return target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield, and it has Annihilator 2. And you might be looking at this and thinking, why would we want to get rid of this? This is both reanimation and a target for reanimation. And the short answer is we only get the actual reanimation off the artisan if we cast it. We do not want to be casting a 9 mana spell. If we're at the point where we're casting this for free, that's where we want to be. But if we're not casting it for its actual 9 mana, then we're not doing anything. Casting it for free or reanimating it out of our graveyard, that's not going to get us anything. That's just going to get us a 10-9 with Annihilator 2, which admittedly is pretty great, but people are going to look at it and immediately know they have to kill it or they're going to be sacrificing permanents, so it's kind of a big trade-off. Dauthi Embrace, much more efficient when it comes to actually removing an entire player, so Artisan of Kozilek, unfortunately, taking the hit on this out-of-budget upgrade. But that brings us to the end of our actual deck tech. We do have to take a second, though, to talk about how this deck performs in a game. And the main way we can do that is, of course, to play a game with the deck. So this week, I am being joined by Bilal, Shawn, and Jason, and we are going to put our Phage deck to the test against what is essentially just a lot of green. So first up, we have Bilal playing Wilson, Refined Grizzly. Notably, he could have a background with Wilson, but Wilson doesn't really share the spotlight, so he is all alone in this endeavor, and I think this is probably the deck that I'm the most concerned about, just before we even get to the other two, because I know how powerful Wilson can be. He's just a 2-mana 2/2, but he has every ability that exists. He can't be countered, he's got Vigilance, he's got Reach, Trample, Ward 2, and I'm sure Bilal has plenty of other ways to also pump up the Grizzly Bear. So Wilson is my biggest concern at the table, mostly because I really don't know what's in Bilal's deck. I've played against the Tanazir and the Swarmlord before, so I kind of know what to expect, but I don't know what to expect with Wilson, and that tends to be the scariest part. Next up, though, Shawn's Tanazir Quandrix deck. This is, as you may be able to guess, a +1/+1 counter deck. So he wants to put a ton of +1/+1 counters on his creatures. He wants to make them as big as possible and then just kind of steamroll his opponents by making them as big as Tanazir with the counters on them and just doing a ton of damage. Next up, we have Jason, who took Tanazir Quandrix and just added red to it for the Swarmlord. This is also a +1/+1 counter deck, and it's mostly a Tyrannid deck, but it's not 100% the precon. Jason has taken to modifying it a little bit and improving it, so he still wants to put counters on stuff. He's still going to focus on having Tyrannids, but there's also a little bit of extra support that he's thrown in as well. I think most of the upgrades came from the mana base, but these are going to be our opponents for the week. Like I said, a lot of green, a lot of +1/+1 counters. But I am very excited to see how this game turns out. I think it'll be interesting being the only black deck at the table. I'm not sure if that's going to be a good thing or a bad thing for us, but we'll see how it goes. I hope you all like the deck tech. If you did, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel. We are getting super close to our 500 subscribers. I would love to hit that with everybody. And I suppose, without any further ado, let's get into it, and I will talk to you all once the game is done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Bilal, Shawn, and then Jason. On my first turn, I play a Swamp. Bilal plays a Forest and casts Zephyr Boots. Shawn plays a Breeding Pool untapped, paying 2 life, then casts Brainstorm, drawing 3 cards and putting 2 back on top of his library. Jason plays a Ketria Triome. I play a Swamp. Bilal plays a Forest and casts his commander, Wilson Refined Grizzly. Shawn plays a Forest and casts Simic Signet. Jason plays a Training Center. I play a Swamp. Bilal plays a Forest, then equips Wilson with the Zephyr Boots, giving him flying and letting Bilal draw a card and discard a card when he deals combat damage to an opponent, which he immediately does, attacking me for 2. Shawn casts Edric, Spymaster of Trest, letting any player draw a card when they do combat damage to one of his opponents. He then plays a Simic Growth Chamber, returning a forest to his hand. Jason plays a Mountain and casts Adelan Jackal, which lets him search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped when it deals combat damage to a player. Then, thanks to it having haste, Jason is able to attack me for 2, draw a card, and search his library for a forest, putting it into play. I play a Swamp and cast Feed the Swarm, paying 2 for Ward, destroying Wilson and losing 2 life. Bilal plays a forest and casts Mana Gorger Hydra, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever any player casts a spell. Shawn plays a forest and attacks Jason for 2, drawing a card. Then in his second main phase, he casts Beast Whisperer, drawing a card whenever he casts a creature spell. Jason plays an island and attacks me for 2, drawing a card and searching his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Then in his second main phase, he casts Soul Ring and casts Defiler of Vigor, letting him pay 2 life instead of a green mana in a spell's casting cost, and also put a +1/+1 counter on each green creature he controls when he casts a green permanent spell, which he does, casting Incubation Druid. I play a swamp and cast Clackbridge Troll, giving Bilal 3/0/1 goat tokens when it enters. Then when I move to combat, Bilal sacrifices a goat to tap the troll, letting me gain 3 life and draw a card. Bilal plays a forest and casts Destiny Spinner, making his creatures and enchantments uncounterable, then casts Galta Primal Hunger. He moves to combat and attacks me with the Mana Gorger for 7, drawing a card. Shawn plays an Opal Palace and attacks me for 2, drawing a card, then casts his commander, Tanazir Quandrix, drawing another card. Jason plays an island and casts Tyrannid Prime, giving all his creatures evolve and also triggering the Defiler, putting a +1/+1 counter on all of his creatures. He also casts Gargoyle Flock, putting another counter on all of his creatures and triggering the evolve on the Prime, putting an additional counter on it. This also lets him create a 1/1 Tyrannid Gargoyle token in his end step if he had a creature enter the battlefield this turn. After that, he casts Urban Evolution, drawing 3 cards and being able to play an additional land this turn, which he does, playing an Evolving Wilds, and finally, at the end of his turn, he makes a Gargoyle token. I play a swamp and cast Death Tyrant, letting me make a 2/2 zombie token whenever an attacking creature I control or a blocking creature an opponent controls dies. Then, when I move to combat, Bilal sacrifices a goat, tapping my troll, letting me gain 3 life and draw a card. Second main phase, I cast Vorpal Sword. Bilal plays a forest and equips the Zephyr Boots to Galta, giving him flying and letting Bilal draw a card and discard a card when it deals combat damage to an opponent. He moves to combat, attacking Jason for 14, and in response, Jason sacrifices the Evolving Wilds to search his library for basic land, putting it into play tapped. Then he takes the 14 damage and Bilal draws a card. Shawn plays an island and casts Llanowar Elves, drawing a card, moves to combat, attacking me for 4 with Tanazir, drawing another card. Then in his second main phase, he casts Oko, Thief of Crowns, and activates Oko's +1 ability, turning Mana Gorger Hydra into a 3/3 elk with no abilities, but it does get to keep its +1/+1 counters. Jason plays a forest and casts his commander, the Swarm Lord, putting a +1/+1 counter on all of his creatures and an additional counter on everything except the Defiler thanks to Evolve. Then the Swarm Lord allows him to draw a card when a creature he controls with counters on it dies, and he moves to combat, attacking Shawn for 7 with the Jackal, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped, and then also attacks Oko for 6, killing the Planeswalker. I play a swamp, and when I go to combat, nobody sacrifices a creature, so I get to attack Bilal for 4 with the Death Tyrant, drawing a card. In my second main phase, I cast Incarnation Technique, demonstrating so Shawn and I both cast an additional copy of it. This lets me mill 5 and return a creature from my graveyard to the battlefield, returning Asmodeus the Archfiend, exiling any cards I draw, but letting me pay a black mana to put all exiled cards into my hand and lose that much life, as well as pay 3 mana to draw 7 cards. Then Shawn mills 5 and returns a creature from his graveyard to the battlefield, getting Cultivator of Blades, which gets 2 +1/+1 counters and gives his other attacking creatures +X/+X when it attacks where X is its power. Finally, I mill 5 more, returning Angel of Suffering from my graveyard to the battlefield, preventing all damage that would be dealt to me, but making me mill 2 cards for each damage prevented. I then equip Clackbridge Troll with the Vorpal Sword, giving it +2/+0, Death Touch, and letting me pay 8 mana to make an opponent lose the game if they're dealt damage by the equipped creature. Bilal plays a forest and attacks me for 12 with Galta, but the damage is prevented, milling me for 24. Then in his second main phase, Bilal casts Titan of Industry, putting a shield counter on Galta and destroying the Vorpal's sword. Shawn casts Hydroid Crassus for X equals 4, entering with 4 +1/+1 counters, gaining 2 life and drawing 3 cards. He then plays an Orin Reef the Vastwood and passes. Jason plays a Path of Ancestry and attacks me for 21 total damage. I block the Jackal with the Troll and a Gargoyle with the Angel, killing both of Jason's creatures, letting him draw a card. Then the remaining 14 damage is prevented and I mill 28 total cards. Then in Jason's second main phase, he casts Malanthrope, exiling my graveyard and putting 15 +1/+1 counters on it since there were 15 creatures exiled this way, also putting a +1/+1 counter on all his other creatures. After that, he casts Mawloc for X equals 5, entering with 5 +1/+1 counters, drawing Jason a card and fighting the Beast Whisperer, killing it and exiling it, while Jason puts another +1/+1 counter on all of his creatures. Finally, he casts Rampant Growth, searching his library for a basic land, and at the end of turn, makes a Gargoyle. On my turn, I pay 3 mana to exile 7 cards with Asmodeus, paying an extra 1 to put them all into my hand, losing 8 life. Then I cast Braid's Arisen Nightmare, play a Guildless Commons, returning a swamp to my hand, and in my end step, I sacrifice a swamp with Braids, making each opponent do the same or forcing them to lose 2 life while I draw a card. In this case, Jason sacrifices a mountain, while Bilal and Shawn lose 2 life and I draw 2 cards. Bilal plays a forest, and then casts Bear Umbra, enchanting Galta, letting him untap all of his lands when Galta attacks and giving him totem armor. He then recasts his commander Wilson, and moves to combat, attacking Shawn for 14 with Galta, untapping all of his lands when he attacks. Then when it deals damage, Bilal draws a card and then discards a card. Second main phase, he re-equips the Zephyr Boots to Mana Gorger Hydra, and also casts Belt of Giant Strength before passing. Shawn casts Return of the Wild Speaker and Triumph of the Hordes, giving his creatures a total of +4/+4, Trample, and Infect. In response, Bilal casts Beast Within, destroying the Hydroid Crassus, but giving Shawn a 3/3 Beast. This lets him attack Jason with Tanazir and Bilal with the rest of his creatures, triggering Tanazir, giving all his creatures base power and toughness 8/8. Then the Cultivator gives all his creatures +14/+14 on top of the +4 they've already received. Jason and Bilal both block as much as possible, with Jason taking 5 Infect, and Bilal getting knocked out by taking 21 Infect while blocking 3 creatures, and Edric die, making me 3 zombies, and then Shawn draws 2 cards. In his second main phase, he plays a Karn's Bastion. Jason plays a Rejuvenating Spring, and then attacks Shawn with his entire board, doing a total of 35 damage, knocking him out even through the blocks, which does give me an additional zombie token. Then in his second main phase, Jason casts Exocrine for X equals 8, drawing a card and doing 8 damage to each other creature and each player. This wipes my entire board, and since Angel of Suffering is still in play, mills me for 16 total cards. Unfortunately, I only had 11 cards left in my library, so when I go to draw for my turn, I immediately lose, winning Jason the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game, and I know I say that for every game that I play, but this one was legitimately one of my favorite games I've played in a long time. It was super cool to see all the decks at the table really do their thing. Bilal was able to make a ton of massive creatures and swing for a ton of damage. Shawn was able to make a ton of massive creatures and swing for a ton of damage. Jason was able to make a ton of creatures and swing for a ton of damage. So it was very, very cool to see the 3 green decks and the 2 +1/+1 counter decks too really just build up their forces and kind of start hitting each other as quickly as they can. And it was also a ton of fun to see that Angel of Suffering really put in a ton of work, even so much that it knocked me out of the game. Jason was very proud of the fact that he was able to knock me out with Mill in a Tyrannid +1/+1 counter deck. Not something he ever thought he would do, so a ton of fun. As unfortunate as it is to have been knocked out in the game because I was super, super close to actually winning it, I don't mind losing that way because it was pretty funny and it was a good time. So I hope you all enjoyed the game as much as I enjoyed playing it. I hope you liked the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.